Morning, everybody. I'm curious, Logan, did you all plan that song after the Lord's Supper talk? You did? Okay, well, it was perfect. It was just great. That's one of my favorite passages in Romans. We overwhelmingly conquer through Christ who saved us. We're more than conquerors through him. And nothing can separate us from the love of God because of Jesus Christ. That's good news. And that's the good news of the gospel of Jesus. And so, just completely shifting gears from everything I just said, it's really good to see everybody this morning. Really good to worship together. We've got a lot of visitors, whether you're here to go camping or to visit your degenerate son, Colt. We're glad that you're here. We love him so much. We're glad that you're here, and we've been blessed by your presence. Just in the past couple of weeks, we've been talking about a lot of shepherds. We've been talking about shepherds a lot lately, and we explained a couple of weeks ago how the word pastors that might show up in Ephesians 4:11 is just the Latin word for shepherd. And we went through a bunch of different passages and talked about how it's all the same office, whether it's elders or overseers or shepherds, it's all the same office. We saw in Ephesians 4 last week where one of the duties of shepherds in a local congregation is to equip the saints for service. And we talked about that quite a bit. This past Wednesday night, if you were here, Logan Salmons, our brother from Mount Sterling, he came and taught a lesson over Psalm 23. And if you weren't here, I highly encourage you, when it shows up on the website, take a listen to that. And we were talking about how the Lord is our shepherd. And at the end of that, he got to John chapter 10. And I didn't plan it like Logan and Michael did this morning. I didn't plan it, but I want to go to John 10. That's exactly where he ended on Wednesday night. And let's go over to John chapter 10, please. And we're going to talk more about how Jesus is the good shepherd. He is the good shepherd. And this is an amazing account. He shows us what it means to be the good shepherd. And so while you're turning over to John chapter 10, just for a little bit of context, Jesus has been teaching and preaching and performing miracles all around the Feast of Tabernacles or the Feast of Booths. And if you remember specifically in John chapter 9, there was a man who was born blind. He hadn't seen one day of his life. He was born blind. And Jesus healed that man. And there was a huge hubbub about Jesus healing that man. The Pharisees were refusing to believe in who Jesus was by him healing this man who had never seen a day in his life. Even his parents were saying, we have no idea how this happened. We have no explanation for this. The Pharisees were refusing to see who Jesus was. And this blind man accepted Jesus as being the Son of God. And Jesus really rebukes those Pharisees. He says, if you were blind, you would see who I am. But because you say that you see, you're actually blind at the end of John chapter 9. And that brings us up to where we are in John chapter 10. So this would be a great opportunity for Jesus if he doesn't want, the Pharisees to dislike him, if he doesn't want to catch any heat for the things that he's been saying, to back off. This would be a great opportunity for him to sort of, lift up on the accelerator a little bit and just say, well, maybe it's not as harsh as maybe I'm trying to say. He doesn't do that at all this morning. We're going to see that Jesus doubles down on the religious leadership of the day, and he's going to say some amazing things about who he is. So I'm really excited to talk about this. But before we actually dive into the text, I think it's really important for us to understand how shepherds would shepherd in the first century. I've never owned sheep. I don't know about you. I don't know anything about watching after or taking care of sheep, other than what I've read. And it's really helpful for me to understand some of the practices of the first century so that we can understand what Jesus is saying. And so one of the things here is the way that they would have their sheepfold or their sheep pen. One of the ways that they could have done this could have looked like this. I don't know if you can see this very well. It's kind of a blurry picture. But one way is attached to their house would be a courtyard. And a lot of time people didn't have a lot of sheep. They may have just had a few sheep. And so if they're in a village, there would be a little courtyard attached to their house. Often it would be made of stone, and on top they would put thorns all along the top. So if people are trying to come in, ouch, those thorns hurt. Or if some wolves try to come, those thorns hurt. And you can see there's only one opening. There's only one opening. And on these types of sheepfolds or sheep pens, a lot of times because it's attached to their house, they would actually have a physical door there. I don't think there's one in this one, but in a lot of these, there would be a physical door, but there's only one way in, and it's through that door. So if you want to try and come in another way, you're going to be met with thorns. There's only one way in. And sometimes they would even share a courtyard because they didn't have a lot of different sheep. So that's really, really important. And because it was attached to their house, oftentimes they might have one of their servants or one of their children or a relative would watch the door through the night. They would be a gatekeeper, a doorkeeper, so they would let people in or out or refuse access to people. But there's another type of sheepfold or a sheep pen, if you will, that was in the first century, and it would look something like this. It didn't have to be rectangular. It could be round. Actually, I think most of them were round. This is what they would do out in the pasture. So in the summer months, when they're just letting them graze freely and be out in the pasture, this was sometimes with branches that were twisted and intertwined together. Other times it's stones like this. And on this kind, oftentimes they didn't have a physical door. I hope that you see there's still only one entrance. They'd put thorns everywhere else. There's only one entrance, but the shepherd himself would actually be the door at night. The shepherd, I don't know if you can see it here, but they would sleep laying across the opening. There's only one way in. He would keep those sheep in and keep everybody else out. And the shepherd himself would actually be the door. And so I think knowing that about sheep pens and the sheepfolds of the first century is really going to illuminate for us what Jesus is saying in this passage. And so I'm going to take those off, but think about those and try to keep those in mind as we read through the text this morning. So John chapter 10, let's read verses 1 through 6. Verses 1 through 6. Jesus says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, he who does not enter by the door," your version might say gate or entrance, into the fold of the sheep, but climbs up some other way, he's a thief and a robber. But he who enters by the door is a shepherd of the sheep. To him the doorkeeper opens, and the sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he puts forth all his own, he goes ahead of them, and the sheep follow him because they know his voice. A stranger, they simply will not follow. Your translation might say they will never follow a stranger, but will flee from him because they do not know the voice of strangers. Verse 6, this figure of speech Jesus spoke to them, but they did not understand what those things were which he'd been saying to them. So here in these first 6 verses, Jesus starts, and he starts talking about people who don't enter by the door of the sheep gate. Now, no matter what kind of sheep gate it is, there's only one entrance. And he says, if you don't go in the door, what business do you have with these sheep? Why are you trying to get in? He's saying they're thieves and they're robbers. If you're not going to go by the one way in the door, you've got some nefarious purpose for going in here. I mean, there's thorns over there. You don't want to mess with those thorns, but if you're willing to do that, you're a thief and you're a robber is what Jesus is saying here. But then he contrasts that with, if you're willing to go through the one opening the right way, the way that it works, he says that's the shepherd. The shepherd knows this is the way to get in. He knows that this is the right way. He knows he has the authority to come in this way. And those other people don't have the authority to go in the right way. And that's why they're going around. So he's saying that the shepherd goes in the right way when these other people have these nefarious purposes trying to get in there. And notice he mentions a doorkeeper or a gatekeeper in verse 3. What's fascinating about the actual word in our translations here that say fold up in verse 1, it's literally courtyard. And so it's likely that what Jesus is talking about is the courtyard where it's attached to their house. In this case, we're going to see where maybe he shifts a little bit later. And again, in those courtyard ones that were attached to their houses, a lot of times there was a physical door and there was a gatekeeper. And so if the gatekeeper sees somebody who shouldn't be going in, access denied, right? But he says, if he sees the shepherd, the rightful owner, the person who has every right and authority to come in here, the door's wide open. I'm going to open that door for them. There's no issues with anything that's going on here. And notice in verse 3, some of these things he says about the shepherd. Some of the things he says about the shepherd. He goes right in. He has no ulterior motives. The shepherd's recognized by the doorkeeper. But this right here, he says, the sheep hear his voice. And he calls those sheep by name. He knows each one of them by name. And he leads them out. This is a very personal relationship between the shepherd and the sheep. They hear his voice. They listen to his voice. He knows them by name and he leads them out. Notice here, it doesn't say that the shepherd drives them out. One thing I do know about sheep is that a lot of times you got to kind of drive them a little bit, maybe like a cattle prod with that little hook thing. But he doesn't say that here. He says he leads them out. He doesn't have to drive them or force them out. They hear his voice. He knows them by name and he leads them out. And they follow him willingly. That's a close personal relationship between the shepherd and these sheep. In verse 4, he says, when he puts forth all his own, so when they've all come out of the sheepfold, he goes ahead of them. Again, he's not driving them from the back, hitting them with this prod or come on, let's go. I'm trying to get you to go where I need you to go. The sheep follow him because they know his voice. It's not just that they hear it. They know this is my shepherd. There's a relationship of trust built up and they follow him. They're willing to follow him. But then big contrast in verse 5 is there's somebody who comes around and there isn't this relationship of trust that's built up. Some stranger, they hear his voice and they say, okay, I hear that voice, but I don't know it. And I am not following that person. That's not my shepherd. I am not following that person. I really like the translation. They will never follow that person. I really like that because that's not their shepherd. They know, but they will flee from him because they don't follow the voice of strangers. So this really close personal relationship between the shepherd and his sheep. He knows their names. They know his voice. They only follow him. And what I really like about this is I see myself in verse 6. I don't know if you can relate to this, but I would be these people in verse 6. They have no idea what he's talking about. They have no idea. And I would have been much worse than these people if I had been in those days. But they say that they don't understand those things which he was saying to them. And so thankfully and very gracefully, Jesus is going to explain. And what's fascinating is notice who Jesus says he is as we're going to read this section. So this next section, let's read verses 7 through 10. 7 through 10. So Jesus said to them again, truly, truly, I say to you, I am the door of the sheep. All who came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not hear them. I am the door. If anyone enters through me, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. So here, before we get to the good shepherd stuff, Jesus says, I'm the door. I'm the gate. I'm the entrance into the sheepfold. And what's fascinating about this, it really doesn't matter which type of sheepfold we're talking about here. If there was a physical door or if the shepherd was the door, either way, it's the same message. Jesus is saying he is the only way into the sheepfold. He is the only way to get in. There's no other opening in that sheepfold. It's enclosed and there's thorns around it. He is the only entrance into the sheepfold. And in verse 8, there's this indictment on those thieves and robbers who came before. Remember in chapter 9, he's just been rebuking the Pharisees for choosing to be blind to who he is and not leading the people in the way that they needed to be led. And there's this vast history in the Bible of the religious leadership of the Jews being called bad shepherds. I mean, I just think about passages like Jeremiah 23 and Ezekiel 34, where instead of shepherding the sheep, what they do is they eat the fat. They take the wool and make clothes for themselves. They feed themselves, but they refuse to feed the sheep. They scatter and disperse the sheep and only look after themselves. And so I think what Jesus is talking about here, these thieves and robbers, is that religious Jewish leadership who had not been shepherding the people the way that they ought to have been shepherded. And he's saying, I'm the door, and they weren't coming in the door. So that's a really big problem, really big problem. But here, they don't have the same authority as Jesus to just go through the entrance, the rightful entrance into this place. And notice in verse 8, he says, the sheep don't listen to them. They don't hear them. I think that's really significant as well. But then Jesus makes this dramatic contrast again from these thieves and these robbers in verse 9, when again he says, I am the door. And if anyone enters through me, he says, he will be saved. He will go in and out and find pasture. Now, what's fascinating about that is we looked at those two different types of sheepfolds. One was connected to their houses and associated with the villages, where he says, go in and out and find pasture. That's related very much to the second one that we looked at that was out in the fields and he would sleep and be the door. So that kind of makes a lot more sense where they go in and out and find pasture. But either way, the message is still the same. If anyone enters through Jesus, the only door, they'll be able to go in and out and they will have life. They'll be saved. And so verse 10, he says that again, that those thieves, those robbers, they only come in to steal and destroy and take advantage of these sheep. But what we're going to see the good shepherd, but he's the door right here. He says, anyone that comes to me through me may have life and have it abundantly. Your translation might say to the full. I really like that too. Jesus is the only entrance. He's the only way. If you enter through him, you'll be saved, go in and out and find pasture. He's the only way. And that's so, so important. But as we keep reading, Jesus shifts which character he is here. So he's no longer going to be the door. And now he's going to be the good shepherd in the next couple of verses. So let's read verses 11 through 18, please. 11 through 18. So verse 11, I am the good shepherd, and the good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. He who is a hired hand and not a shepherd, who is not the owner of the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees, and the wolf snatches them and scatters them. He flees because he's a hired hand and he's not concerned about the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my own know me. Even as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. Verse 16, I have other sheep which are not of this fold. I must bring them in also. They will hear my voice. They will become one flock with one shepherd. For this reason, the Father loves me, because I lay down my life so that I may take it again. No one has taken it away from me, but I lay it down on my own initiative. I have authority to lay it down, and I have authority to take it up again. This commandment I received from my Father. So here in these verses, Jesus, again, in contrast to those thieves and robbers, he says, I am the good shepherd. I am the good shepherd. And instead of taking advantage of the sheep, like these thieves and robbers want to do, or bad shepherds of the past had done, he lays down his life for the sheep. Now, Logan mentioned this on Wednesday night, and it's so important. This is highly abnormal. This is not normal behavior for a shepherd at all. He pointed out, and this is a great point, that with being a physical, real shepherd, losses were expected at some point. Whether it be wild animals, maybe thieves, or sickness or disease, losses were expected. As long as you were able to provide evidence for why those losses happened, it's kind of like, all right, you're forgiven, and we'll just move on with the sheep that you have. And that's one of the things that makes David in the Old Testament stand out. He fights a bear, he fights a lion to protect his sheep. It's like, whoa, that's a lot bigger than what people are willing to do. And Jesus says, I lay down my life for these sheep. I lay down my life willingly. I lay down my life for these sheep. Where everybody else, even shepherds who this was their occupation, would say, they're just sheep. Their lives aren't worth risking my life. If there's a chance that I'm going to go after this bear and lion and I'm going to die, they're just sheep and they're not worth it. So there's no way I'm putting my life on the line. But Jesus here says, I willingly lay down my life for the sheep so that they may have life. This is highly abnormal. And he even brings that out as he keeps going, because in verse 12, he says, he who's a hired hand, so somebody who is paid to do this, but not the owner, not the shepherd himself, he says, if a wolf is coming, that guy's saying, I just work here, man. That wolf, I'm not doing it. They're just sheep. They're not worth it. So he runs away. I just work here. It's not worth my life. And so in verse 12, it says that the sheep are either snatched by the wolves or they scatter. That hired hand is not concerned about those sheep. And that's exactly what Jesus says in verse 13. He runs because he's not concerned about the sheep. That's pretty normal behavior for shepherds of the day. But verse 14, I am the good shepherd, and I know my own, and my own know me. That's huge in and of itself. Jesus is saying, my flock, my sheep know who I am, and I know them intimately. How intimately are we talking about? In verse 15, he says, even as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, so I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. Jesus is comparing the close personal relationship that he has with his sheep and that the sheep have with him to God the Father and God the Son, and the relationship between God the Son and God the Father. Does it get any more unified than that? Does it get any more close and intimate and personal relationship than that? No, it doesn't. This is unbelievable. This is highly personal for Jesus with his sheep here. And so in verse 15, he says it again, I laid down my life for the sheep. They're not just sheep to Jesus. They are valued, treasured possessions. And he lays down his life for the sheep. Verse 16 is fascinating. And I really think that the Jewish audience would have really wondered what he's talking about at verse 16. He says, I have other sheep which are not of this fold, and I must bring them also. They will hear my voice. They will become one flock with one shepherd. What's fascinating about this is if he's talking about the courtyard sort of sheep pen, people had those in the villages. Maybe they had several different courtyards. And so it would be very easy to say, look, here's my sheep in this fold, but there's some over there that are going to be joined to this one. And so the physical image would make sense to them. But then Jesus is really trying to get them to start thinking some Old Testament prophet language about how when the Messiah comes, he's going to make one flock of all of these sheep from all the nations. And I don't know if they put it together, but this is what Jesus is trying to say. He's talking about bringing in the Gentiles. It wouldn't just be the Jews anymore, but Gentiles would come in too. And notice he says, you're going to be one flock. There's not going to be distinction, and there's going to be one shepherd, him. And so in verses 17 and 18, he just reiterates again, the Father loves me because I lay down my life for those sheep, and I take it again. And in verse 18, he makes it very clear. Jesus is not a victim of circumstances. He's not a victim of circumstances. He is the agent in control. He's the one making these things happen. He says, I have the authority to lay my life down, and I have the authority to take it back up again. And it was a commandment that he received from the Father. And he says at the beginning of verse 18, nobody takes it away from me. Nobody takes my life, but I lay it down willingly. And I think that's so important. In 8 verses, he says 5 times, I lay down my life for the sheep. Do you think that's an important concept in these verses? In 8 verses, he says, I lay it down. Nobody does it for me. Nobody makes me do it. I do it by my own authority. I lay down my life. And so it's just so important that we see what Jesus is saying here. He lays down his life so that these sheep will live. Again, most people would say they're just sheep. They're not worth it. To Jesus, they are. Let's look at the people's reaction to this, because I think it's very telling. Let's keep reading verses 19 through 21. I mean, whatever your reaction is right now to hearing this, imagine that you are a first century Jew and you hear Jesus say this. What do you think your reaction would be? Let's see what theirs was. Look at verse 19. Verse 19. A division occurred again among them because of these words. Many of them were saying, he has a demon and is insane. Why do you listen to him? Others were saying, these are not the sayings of one who is demon possessed. A demon can't open up the eyes of the blind, can he? And so we see just in the reaction to this parable that Jesus tells them, there's division that's occurring. Some of these people are saying, this guy is nuts. He's insane. What? Who can listen to this? He's demon possessed. Nobody's going to listen to this. And yet other people are saying, these aren't the words of somebody who's demon possessed. Somebody who's demon possessed can't heal somebody who was born blind, like in John chapter 9. And what's interesting about these reactions is they're proving the point that Jesus has just been making about the sheep. There are sheep that don't hear his voice, that don't know who he is, and don't follow him. These are the ones who are saying, he has a demon. He's demon possessed. He's insane. Who can listen to this guy? But these other people, maybe they don't know the voice of the shepherd yet, but they're starting to put together the evidence, and they're hearing his voice and wondering, this isn't the way that demon possessed people talk. Someone who's demon possessed can't just heal somebody who was born blind, can they? And so they're on their way maybe to becoming sheep at this point. And so this is just an unbelievably rich passage, a rich parable that Jesus tells. There's so much Old Testament that's in here. I wish we had so much more time to go through it. But what I want to do is I want to bring out a few points about this parable, things that are just, we have to know about this parable, and then ask ourselves some questions on how we can apply it to ourselves today. So the first point I want to make from this parable is that you are a sheep. You are a sheep. And that is something that is very unpopular to be called, especially in our political rhetoric today. You see, don't be a sheep, don't be a follower, be a leader, go out, don't take what anybody says. You don't be a sheep. It's bad to be a sheep. Brethren, Jesus says you are a sheep. You are not a shepherd. You're not the shepherd for sure. You are not the shepherd. We don't have that kind of authority. We are sheep. He owns us. He has every right and authority over us because he owns us. And I think this can be really difficult because we may like some of the things that Jesus teaches. We might like some of the ways that people talk about Jesus. But at the end of the day, we might say, yeah, he's my Lord, and then live like he's not. And we live like we're the shepherd and we make the rules and we call the shots and we're the one who leads the sheep. Well, brethren, we don't have that authority. We are sheep, and Jesus is the shepherd, and we have to know that. We don't have that authority. We can't fulfill it. We can't meet his authority level at all. So if we're trying to, we are going to mess up severely. We are sheep, and we have to know that. Number 2 from this passage that we just read is that Jesus is the only way. He's not one way among many ways. He is the only way. Jesus said he's the door or the gate or the entrance into the sheepfold. He's the only way in and out. In verse 9, he says, if anyone goes through him, that he'll be saved. go in and out and find pasture. He says that those who enter through him will have life and have it to the full. They'll have it abundantly. And remember, just from the pictures that we saw of the sheepfolds in the first century, there's only one way in. There's thorns everywhere else. There's only one way in. And if you don't go in that way, the good shepherd is also a protector of the sheep, and he won't let you in. There's only one way into the sheepfold, and that is Jesus. There's no other way in, and we need to embrace it, and we need not be afraid to say it. It's very unpopular in our day and time to say Jesus makes exclusive claims that he is the only way into the sheepfold, and we don't need to run from that. As hard as it might be to hear, these are the words of our Lord, and as his sheep, we should just repeat them. He's the only way into the sheepfold. He's not one among many, the only way, and we must enter through him. We have to know that. Okay, a third thing, and this one seems really obvious from this whole parable, is that Jesus is the shepherd. Jesus is the shepherd, and he explicitly states that he's the good shepherd in verse 11 and in verse 14. And again, I wish we had so much time to just go through all the Old Testament passages about this, because Yahweh God is called a shepherd all throughout your Old Testament. Yahweh God is called a shepherd. There are passages in the prophets about how the Messiah, the Christ, would be a shepherd and shepherd his people Israel and bring in all the nations to his flock. And so when Jesus says, I am the good shepherd, it is a loaded, it's a loaded word that he's saying. To a Jewish audience, they would be making connections to the Old Testament. In at least 10 of the Psalms, Yahweh is called a shepherd. And so they'd be thinking, what's this guy saying? What is he trying to say about himself by calling himself the good shepherd? I think Jesus is claiming to be Yahweh, and he's claiming to be the Messiah, the Christ that all those Old Testament prophets prophesied about. And so this would have gotten them, what's this guy talking about? And I think that's also why we see their reaction is, this guy has a demon. How can he say these things? He's making some really bold claims that we need to understand as well, that Jesus is the good shepherd. He's claiming to be Yahweh. He's claiming to be the Messiah, the Christ, and we need to know that. We need to remember that. Then the last point I want to make about this passage is that it's very personal for Jesus. This is probably my favorite one out of all these this morning. That Jesus being the only way, that Jesus being the shepherd, that all of us are sheep, with all of his authority that he has, with all of the magnificence of Yahweh, with all of the honor as the Messiah, as the Christ, it's still very, very personal to his sheep. Some of the things I want to notice here, I hope that you see in verse 3, the good shepherd calls his sheep by name. By name. He knows your name. And he leads them out. He doesn't drive them out. In verse 14, it says that he knows his sheep, just like God the Father knows God the Son. That personal, close, intimate relationship, he says he has that with his sheep, and his sheep have that with him. It's deeply personal for Jesus. And so I think about over in Luke 15, where Jesus talks about how the shepherd will leave the 99 and go and find the one. If you're like me, I've read that before and just been like, okay, so here's 99 sheep. You're looking around and it's like, oh, I think one's missing. I better go find them. I don't know. Let's go look for where they are. When I think based on John chapter 10, it looks a lot more like this. Where's David? Where is David? I have to go find him. I'm going to leave everybody else and I'm going to go find David. And because I know David, just like the Father knows me and I know the Father, I bet he's over here because I know him. And I know where he trips up. I know where he needs help. It's deeply personal for Jesus. It looks a lot more like, I didn't ask anybody if I could say their name, but it looks a lot more like, where's Ted? I have to go find Ted. Where is he? I love him. I need to go find him. Where's Mary? I have to go find her. I'm going to go find her, and I know her, and I need her. Where's Mary? Do you see how that changes the calculus of all of this? It's deeply personal for Jesus. And one of the questions that I don't have on my list, but is it personal for us? It's very personal for Jesus. Very, very personal for us. And so Jesus said 5 times in 8 verses that he lays down his life for the sheep. Nobody forces him to. And remember, even for shepherds of the day, that's not normal. It's not normal to lay down your life so that your sheep can live. Everybody's thinking they're just sheep. They're not worth your time. They're not worth your life. Why would you risk your life? They're just sheep. It's not a big deal. To Jesus, brethren, this is so amazing. You are not just a sheep. You are a sheep. but you're not just a sheep in the way that other shepherds would have viewed that. Where any other normal shepherd would say, oh, a thief or a robber's coming in, I could get killed. There's wolves coming. I'm out of here. This is just a job. I'm out of here. Jesus willingly lays his life down so that you can live. He knows your name. He knows you, and he died for you individually. It's amazing. Really just a mind-boggling thing. And so after seeing that we're sheep, Jesus is the only way, he's the shepherd and the kind of shepherd that Jesus is, I just want to ask ourselves a couple of questions from this parable about what kind of sheep that we are. And the first question is, do you know his voice? Do you know the voice of the shepherd? In verses 3-5, the sheep hear the voice of the shepherd, they know his voice, and they will not follow a stranger. Some translations say they'll never follow a stranger because they know that's not my shepherd. They will only follow their shepherd. Even sheep are able to distinguish between their shepherd and an imposter and a stranger. And so for us today, what kind of sheep are we? Do we know the voice of our good shepherd? Are you able to distinguish the teachings of Jesus from the teachings of an imposter, or what people say the teachings of Jesus are, that is not at all what Jesus said? The way that we do that is we've got to get into his word and study these words that Jesus taught and he preached, and we have to get into his scripture and prayerfully grow into all aspects into Christ himself. Otherwise, we might end up following a stranger. We might. What kind of sheep are we? Do you know his voice? Another question this morning is, have you entered the door? Have you entered the door? Jesus said he's the only way into the fold. Salvation, safety, and life. Those things are only found in Jesus. They are not found anywhere else. No other religion, no other worldly, physical pleasure or thing. It is found nowhere else. Jesus is the only way to salvation, safety, and life. Believing that he's the Son of God, knowing that he died willingly for you individually. He knows your name, so that you would have life, and dying to yourself through baptism, joining his family. Jesus is the only way. And if you haven't entered through that door, you're not in the sheepfold. And as exclusive as that is exactly what Jesus says in these passages. Now, the last question I have for all of us this morning is, what will your reaction be to this parable? We read in verses 19-21, we saw some of the reactions of the Jews there. Some of them said, he has a demon. They refused to hear his voice. They said, he's insane. Why would anybody listen to this man? And yet there were some other people who were starting to add things up, putting some evidence together, saying, a demon-possessed man doesn't talk like this. A demon-possessed man can't heal somebody of their blindness that they've had from birth. And so who is this man? Well, brethren, I am thoroughly convinced Jesus is the Son of God, that he is the good shepherd, that he laid down his life for me, that he laid down his life for you so that you can have life and have it abundantly, that you can have it to the full. And we have to enter through him, the door. We have to submit to him as sheep and him be the shepherd. I am fully and thoroughly convinced about that. He laid down his life so that I would live. What is your reaction going to be to that? What will it be? And so as we close this morning, if your reaction is you want to study the scriptures and learn more about this good shepherd, I would love to study with you. I know there's several in here who would love to study with you. Or if you know that Jesus is the only way, he's the only door, there's no other path that you can take that will lead to salvation, life, and safety, and you want to join his family, enter through that door. We've got water and we would love to immerse you, assist you with that, and join his family. Or if you haven't been the sheep that Jesus wants you to be, if you haven't been able to distinguish his voice and know to follow him, and maybe you've been following yourself, trying to be a shepherd yourself, and you're really just a sheep, and you want to make it right with Jesus this morning, there's an opportunity now. While together, we're going to stand and we're going to sing the invitation song.